Now I'd like to introduce Rawiri Smith, who is today's keynote speaker. Ra is an uri of the Wairarapa. An uri is more than tangata, it is whenua too. Ra is descended from explorers like Kupe, Whātonga, and Tamatea Ariki, the priestly Pōpoto, Ruawharo, and Tupai in the Waka kōrero. The Whare Wānanga professors, including Mātoro Hanga, Nuku Tamaroro, and Nepia Pōhuhu, and hapu leaders like Taneiroa, Taiao, and Hini Te Arorangi. Then there is the ancestor who brought peace, Rongotakitaki and Nuku Pewa Pewa. Ra is grateful to be descended from the gods. Io Ranginui and Papatuanuku are familiar, as is Tāne, but other atua like Hini Moana and rongomaiwhiti too. This context means Ra descends from the land and from the waters, including Wairarapa Moana. Ra's keynote today discusses how do we lift Wairarapa Moana from the too hard basket and restore its value. Tēnā koe Ra.
Okay,
Ra, you're just on.
Kei te mihi kia koutou, nau mai haramai ki taku kōrero. My speech today is in this theme of Restoration Day, which is whakanuia, kia whakanuia te Taiao. And so kia is like a command, and whakanui, you might have recognized nui as a part of being big, but it also means significant. And so whakanuia is to make significant. And then the Taiao is the environment. And so what we're wanting to do is to make significant our environment. My speech is how do we lift Wairarapa Moana from the too hard basket and restore its value. One of the ways that we can do that is, as is done in normal academic circles, is to look at the problem definition. One of the problems with problem definition is that often the solutions are just surrounded by the problem, when actually if we do something called appreciative inquiry, we can have wider thinking about the possible solutions that we could have. And so with Wairarapa Moana, our problems are there, and they're outlined, things like suspended sediment, low oxygen levels, no macrophytes. And so these are well documented and are usually quite highlighted. So I wanted to move to something else, because even though we might take on all the facts, we might not get behavior change. And often we find that a list of science facts doesn't bring behavior change. Whatever behavior change should be based on the facts, on good research. But if we're not having behavior change, then we need to think about what data do we need so that we could get behavior change from the wider population. And so my speech today is going to be concentrating on this behavior change and what aspects we can think about there. And so one of the things I'm going to concentrate on throughout the speech is, and this kōrero is the Wairarapa culture. Because if we can use the Wairarapa culture and strengthen that, that's something that the people of Wairarapa already appreciate. And so I've got a list of ideas that reflect the Wairarapa culture. And the first one is, you know you're from Wairarapa when you pull up to the moana and you see another car and you think to yourself, overcrowded. And so when we're doing that, some people have suggested that this might be a little bit about our cultural cringe, that this is something that's derogatory, but actually, while it's not only thinking about the solitude of Wairarapa and the smaller population, it is also thinking about the connection that we make when we get to the Moana. And so when we are out in the Moana as people from Wairarapa, we like to think about us in terms of having the beach to ourselves, or having the lake to ourselves, or having the waterways to ourselves. And what that then means is that we're tuned with our environment. In Māori, we call this Maori tau. And Maori is a word that's often heard about, sometimes confused with the word Māori, especially if we're not pronouncing things so well, but Maori is a little more about life essence. But as a definition of life essence, that undervalues actually what Māori is, because Māori is also about the vitality of life. And so the vitality of life when we're out on the beach and there are waves crashing, you can start to feel that and hear that. And if you're lucky enough to get sprayed by the sea, you can feel that in its touch as well. And then in different places like wetlands and around Lake Wairarapa, the Māori is a little more about the stillness that you can see. One lucky day, Wairarapa Moana, when the fog was there. And so that's also the name of a marae called Kahungunu, the significant fog. And one of the reasons why it's significant is because that's a day when there's not so much wind. If there's fog around, there's nothing moving it. And so on that day, I was lucky enough to see the lake reveal itself to me from the lake domain. And so the lake domain in front of me, as I looked south, the fog started clearing and pulling back. It was like the opening of a curtain on the lake. And because there wasn't any suspension of sediment, the lake looked blue as it reflected the sun and reflected the sky, sorry. And so in that moment, the idea of a Maori tau where everything was settled. And so it's a part of our healing, it's a part of our connection. And so as people, if we can connect to our whenua, that's a part of the tangata whenua. In Māori, we also have this kōrero called Wairarapa Moana Te Karu Wai Māori o Te Ika a Maui, eye of the fish of Maui. And this takes on the concept of the North Island being Te Ika a Maui and the South Island being Te Waka a Maui. And so in our national story, we're able to think about us being a part of the whole of New Zealand, but also being a part of being tangata and whenua, or people affected by the land. This isn't the only meaning for tangata whenua. In the treaty context, tangata whenua are the people of the land, of the nation of Aotearoa, and then tangata treaty are the people who the tangata whenua made a treaty with. Another meaning for tangata whenua can be, as kindly explained by Zoe earlier, tangata whenua can be those who have an ancestry to the whenua. And so their whakapapa to the whenua can come down through the atua. So if we think about the first person being created by Tāne, and then Tāne is the god of the forest, that's how we can whakapapa to the forest, to the ngahere. And so there's another kōrero about tangata whenua. In Māori, the first word is often a noun or a verb, and the second word is the adjective or the adverb. And so in tangata whenua, the whenua is describing the tangata. And how does it do that? Well, the effect that the whenua has on tangata is a part about how tangata whenua might feel in terms of its connection. So many people who come to New Zealand from around the world often comment on our whenua in a slightly cheeky way. I'm suggesting that the people who should have got the Academy Award for their acting in The Lord of the Rings should have been the whenua, because the land clearly outperformed anybody else. But that's my view of it. Others might have a different view, but in terms of tangata whenua, it's about how we connect to that whenua. And so today what we're going to be looking at is two different pieces. One in terms of tangata. So the next you know you're from Wairarapa kōrero is you know you're from Wairarapa when you come through the tunnel, through the Remataka tunnel, and you see Lake Wairarapa and you think to yourself, home. And many of us, in terms of coming from a busy day in Wellington and on the train, are looking for that peace, that kind of quiet peace there. And some of us are already asleep by the time we get to the end of the tunnel, but some of us, in terms of appreciating home, see our home and see the lake and think, yeah, we're in Wairarapa right now. And so now Wairarapa Moana is part of the home. But I want to examine that a little further, because actually when some people think of Wairarapa, that word Wairarapa, they think more of the province than they do of the lake. So how can we think more about the lake being our home as well as the province? And part of that might be about how we visit, how we go and see, how we hold that to be important to us. Because as we realise that Wairarapa Moana is a part of our home, we start to realise that Wairarapa has that special connection for us, and that we start to value home. And so rather than having a cultural cringe that sometimes is, how can I get out of here? With the old saying, those people with get up and go have usually got up and gone. And it's not really about that, because actually those people with get up and go can look at making home their special place. And that's a really important thing to do. And so one of the things that we need to remember is that in terms of the kōrero about Wairarapa and its name, is thinking about this Whakataki. The eyes flashing are the glistening waters. So the story about Haunui Ananaia is often told, and Haunui Ananaia is the great grandson of Kupe. So Kupe had a son, his name was Haunui, and then Haunui had a son, his name was Pōpoto, and he was the he was the tōhunga on the Kurahopu waka, the waka that I descend from in terms of my rangitane whakapapa. And so Pōpoto had a son, and his name was Haunui Ananaia, to differentiate him from his grandfather. But Ananaia, Nanaia was his mother. And so Pōpoto and Nanaia had Haunui Ananaia. Haunui Ananaia was travelling around around the lower half of the North Island. And as he travelled, he came to Remataka. Interestingly, for people who might not know this, Remataka is not only the name of a mountain range, but it's the name of a solitary cone. And so when Haunui Ananaia sat on Remataka, he sat there looking like Wairarapa. And as he sat there, the eyes were filled with tears because the sun was shining in his eyes. And so here the kānohi, the flashing, is the sun coming into your eyes, and therefore was glistening. So sometimes we think about glistening waters as the quality of our water in our waterways, and that's fine to be thinking about, because there's plenty of vantage spots that we can look down on our waters and they are glistening. But the actual story comes from the glistening within his eyes. And so in terms of glistening within his eyes, the sun then if we think about us on the train, where we might have our eyes glistening, not because of the sun, but because we're seeing home. That's the kind of value that we want to bring to Wairarapa Moana. We want to understand it as home. So the next you know you're from Wairarapa or kōrero is you know you're from Wairarapa when you're looking for a brand, an aspiration, a part of your culture, and you think to yourself, Wairarapa. So for just the reasons I've talked about, we think about Wairarapa in terms of the glistening waters, but we can also think about that as an aspiration. Because if we stand by the side of Lake Wairarapa now, we might not feel so much mauri, because as we stand there, we might feel some peace, but we might feel that the suspended sediment is blocking out some life, blocking out the opportunity for sun to grow macrophytes, plants within the water. And so then we're thinking, okay, so in this aspiration, we can be thinking, what can we do for the future? So now, in terms of a brand, I know that's a little bit of a marketing ploy, and that some people might feel uncomfortable about the selling, but rather than the selling to us, we're stating what's important to us. And so as a brand, it's a bit more of a brand about what we find as being important, and our Taiao, or our environment, is really important to us. And so then we can start to think, what are some of the things that we can do? Well, luckily, we've had a lot of research happen through Wairarapa Moana, and one of the research groups that we've had is the ESR, the Environmental Science Research, Crown Research Institute, and we've been lucky enough to have some experiments about manuka. And at first, what was found in the lab and tested on the shores of Lake Wairarapa was the ability of manuka to hold hold E. coli. And so if the manuka roots could hold E. coli, then E. coli or other pathogens wouldn't be washed into the waterways. And because if you could hold it for over 2 weeks, and the E. coli wasn't being fed, then the E. coli would die. And then the roots could take up the protein, but what's more important is that living E. coli didn't make it into our waterways and contribute to an unhealthy waterway. And so here's some of those aspirations to have cleaner water being met. A person from another research project in terms of Lakes 380 started to think about water in terms of tuna. So this is a Whakataki about specifically Wairarapa Moana. He wai maru tuna, he wai raka. So a water full of eels and a wooded water. So in terms of the eels, the maru is about it being plentiful. And so if you named yourself Bay of Plenty, sometimes you might get a tag. So we didn't say plentiful, we just said he wai maru tuna. And so it's a place of that supported us. The lake, our tipuna, the moana, has supported us as people in our living. So how are we affected by the whenua? We're affected by it keeping us alive. He Wairarapa, though, is about the wood or the trees that can be, logs that can be in our waterway. And so anciently, when our waterway was surrounded by trees, some of them would fall into the waterway and then be into the lake. And if you're on a waka, this could be quite a danger. I pause to remember some people who have lost their lives in a boating accident on our moana. And so we need to be able to understand our moana, its danger parts, and its benefits. And somewhere else they call that a cost-benefit analysis. But rather than going into economics. In terms of what we're seeing is a little more understanding through the science. So I'd like to reference the ESR project in terms of kia whakanuia a te repo. So when we think of the moana, we think of a number of ecosystems. And so while the lake's an ecosystem, repo or wetlands are another ecosystem. And we need to think about our ecosystems in New Zealand, because as we think of our ecosystems in New Zealand, we think about how our ecosystems are co-evolved. Unlike evolution around the rest of the world, many of our things here in New Zealand, many of our ecosystems here in New Zealand had cooperative ways of being. And so when we think about our lakes and our wetlands that support the lakes by cleansing the water, and thinking about swamp manuka as another cleanser of the water, we can start to think, here's what the asset of our environment is. And so how do we think about that? We need to value our ecosystems, our native ecosystems, a whole lot more than we currently are. If we wanted to do some research and we wanted background information, we often find more background information on exotic trees. We need to appreciate our uniqueness and value our rongomaiwhiti. And that's a really important part about the different things that we can value. Another, you know you're from Wairarapa kōrero is, you know you're from Wairarapa when you go into a cafe and you expect to dodge gumboots. When I put this onto my Facebook page, someone came back to me and said, well, that's just because we're courteous. And that's exactly the point. The people here in Wairarapa are courteous. And one of the things that we can be courteous about is taking on a wide range of thinking. And so rather than thinking, well, this one way is the only way that we're doing it, we could be curious to other knowledge bases and think about how that works. And so often in a collaboration analogy, I put down that there's some different ways of thinking about ourselves in terms of collaboration. One is the fruit salad analogy. And the fruit salad analogy is when you make up some fruit salad and then you put in the pineapple, and the pineapple overpowers the rest of the taste of the fruit salad. So you look like you're picking up a piece of watermelon, but actually what's happening is you're tasting pineapple. And so the kōrero there is that rather than being dominated by one flavor and being assimilated into a pineapple fruit salad, what we want to do is to appreciate each piece of the fruit for its own. Now, there's a way of doing that in collaboration, and that collaboration is a mosaic. So a mosaic has many different pieces. They can be different colors and they can be different textures, but each color and each texture is appreciated for its own independent contribution to the whole of the picture. What's the picture that can define us all? It can be Wairarapa culture. And so Wairarapa culture could be the overall picture, and for everyone, it could be the tangata whenua picture. And so if the Wairarapa, that's for the rest of New Zealand and for the rest of the region in terms of Greater Wellington. And I would remind people that actually in Greater Wellington, the greater part of Greater Wellington, of course, is Wairarapa, because we've got the most land. And so in terms of the mosaic though, for example, in New Zealand history, we recognise that Kupe discovered New Zealand. Others might have discovered the New Zealand too, but here we have the idea in terms of migration and how we might all come together about that. And so one of the Whakataki that we have is mā whero, mā pango, ka ote te mai. By red, by black, the work is completed. And so one of the ways that we can think about weaving everybody together is appreciating everyone for its colour. So in the New Zealand history, we've talked a little bit about we have all of these different contributions that are being made. And so we need, as people, come together and have all of our ideas together. One place we did that just recently was in the whaitua. And so the whaitua is a Māori word for zone. And the whaitua was looking at water quality. And one of the things that the whaitua did in terms of looking at water quality was to have a goal for water quality. And the goal for water quality was to have glistening waters. So Wairarapa, where the water glistens, was our take on that. And so we have put down over 100 recommendations in terms of the things that we want to do around the waterways of the Wairarapa. And so in Lake Wairarapa, we want to have a look at some research there. So on modelling, we found that if we put a metre of water on top of the lake and we put an input from the Rongomaiwhiti into the Lake Wairarapa, we would improve our water quality by 80%. Now, one of the things that we did in terms of in terms of the whaitua was we did this before te mana o te wai was fully expressed. And so te mana o te wai right now means that what we can do is think about the priorities as we manage water. So in the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, te mana o te wai is the impetus or the imperative that talks about how we should treat the water. And so what it's saying is that the first priority should be the water itself. And so when we're managing water, like we might do at Lake Wairarapa, especially around the barrage gates, and then also in the deviation, there's an opportunity that what we're doing there is managing the water. If we're managing the water for the water's sake, then Lake Wairarapa's water quantity is one way that we manage water, but we should be managing water for water quality as well. And so water quality is has been a real important part of te mana o te wai. One of the things that we also discussed was that in all of the subcatchments of Wairarapa Moana, we would, all the subcatchments of the Ruamahanga whaitua, we would think about how repo or wetlands where repo or wetlands are coming through. And so it's the next one, sorry. So the next part is that my time? Sorry. Do I have 45 minutes or 25? 25 minutes, sorry. Sorry, I've just been told that I got 25 minutes left, and I appreciate, the support that we have there. So in terms of the whaitua, we are looking about how we come together. So here's the next you're from Wairarapa when you look out to the lake from the northern end and you think to yourself, moana, or ocean. And that's the way that we are in Wairarapa. We start to think about the big things that are part of Wairarapa. And so if we take on the complexity, traditionally we've taken on the complexity of Wairarapa, Lake Wairarapa and Lake Onuki and Lake Paunui together with the Ruamahanga. And we've said, this is our moana, so how are we looking in terms of this moana? And one of the ways that Lakes 380 did that is in terms of looking at the Wairarapa stories, Lake Wairarapa stories. So one of the things I'd commend to people listening is to go to a on-site called Lake Stories, a website called Lake Stories NZ, and have a look at the Lake Wairarapa stories there. It's been a bit of a, inspiration that collection of stories to see, well, how can we tell the stories of all our waterways right throughout Wairarapa? And some people might say, well, over 300 waterways, that's just too big, isn't it? And one of the things I reflect on is, well, we took on a moana. I think that we can take on all the rest of the waterways as well. The moana is, Lake Wairarapa is 68 square kilometres. And so sometimes when we think, well, what can we do to actually to improve things here? Tinkering around the edges might not get our change. And so one of the difficulties that we have, that people will look in the too hard basket and think it's too big. And so one of the things that I'd recommend is that, well, let's take on the attitude that we had in the past. It's a Wairarapa attitude. A Wairarapa attitude of saying the size of it isn't going to deter us. The complexity of it isn't going to deter us. Recently, over the last 100 years, but we've had this way in science and a way of thinking about things where we reduce things to elements. And we've been reducing things to elements in terms of nitrates, phosphates, and pathogens in terms of water quality. And I'm not going to say that we shouldn't have that. So it's not an either or, this next scenario that I put up, it's an and scenario. The and scenario is thinking about water coming together in ecosystems. So if we have a spring that's bringing water into a wetland, and that wetland is also getting water that's coming back at it from a waterway like a lake or a river, then here in the wetlands, we've got all of these different types of water. And so when we think about that in terms of complexity, we can think about systems complexity. And so one other way of thinking about the aspects of a lake, the characteristics of the lake, is to think of it as and its complexity and take on all of the elements. And so rather than just thinking about elements alone, we think about elements together in a relationship. So how do elements interact with one of those types of things? I'm just thinking about the character of the Lake Wairarapa and thinking that it's te karu o te ika. And te karu o te ika is, as we've said before, the eye of the fish. You know that on a person's head, and unfortunately my head is too good an example of this, is that the forehead is quite a large space on my head. It might be a little more regular on other people's. But in the biggest part of the skull, behind the eyes, are the brains. In Māori, we call that a roro. So the word for computer is a rorohiko, which is an electric brain. And so in terms of roro, the roro is the brain. And so you can see on a map of the North Island that we have two eyes of the ika. One is a freshwater eye, Lake Wairarapa. The other is a saltwater eye. That's Wellington Harbour. But what you don't see is that the brain is actually on the Wairarapa side, because that's where the biggest part of the skull is. And so I'm glad to say that we're the brains of the operation here in Wairarapa. In terms of appreciating the complexity of something like a brain, we think about the ngāhere, and we think about the ngāhere in terms of how many different layers the ngāhere can have, and how many types of water there are. So here's a whakataki about all the different types of water. Ko Wairarapa Māori tēnei, ngā wai. Wai Māori, wai tai, wai tapu, wai kino, wai mate, wai puna, wai tapu, wai ora. This is Wairarapa Moana, the waters: fresh water, tidal water, sacred water, bad water, spring water, and living water. There's a person who lives on the side of the lake at a place called Wairarapa. And I want to mention him specifically today. His name is Charlie Matthews. And I wanted to mention him specifically because I met the Matthews whānau when I was doing a series of stories at St. Patrick's in Featherston. There I met one of the leaders of the kapahaka, and he was Charlie Matthews' son. And his older brother and him were people who were leading the haka. And they so impressed me that I talked to them a little after about their haka. And they told me that they lived on the side of Wairarapa Moana, on the western side. And that their dad was Charlie Matthews, and I had an opportunity to meet their father, and their father talked to me about a section of their land that they had put into the Department of Conservation and Preserving Trees, because Charlie's grandfather is Popo. Popo is our Māori word for grandfather. His Popo loved the ngahere, and Charlie wanted to preserve some of them. And so what happened is that we talked to Charlie a little bit about Wairarapa, the waters of rongomai. There's a atua in Māori called rongomaiwhiti, and rongomaiwhiti is the god of comets. And the kōrero is that the god of comets came down to Wairarapa Moana and drank from our waters. The atua, in terms of the god of comets, is obviously a part that is rare. And so one of the things in terms of the rarity is thinking about our uniqueness, but thinking about how all of those things come together in a co-evolved ecosystem where we can blend all together. So one of the important things that happened for Wairarapa Moana was Ramsar. We need to build on top of Ramsar. Ramsar is saying that our waters are significant for birds, migratory birds that come from the northern hemisphere, some who fly as far as Antarctica, Arctic Circle. Antarctica is pretty close. Arctic Circle in terms of coming all the way to New Zealand. And so when we think about migratory birds, can we build on that? Is there a place for migratory fish? Our tuna, our eels come from Tonga and come all the way to come to Wairarapa and come to our waters into Lake Wairarapa. It's what used to be our feeder as a traditional people, being able to feed on tuna, but in a way that was sustainable. How can we think about building the sustainability of our fish? There's another group of people who migrated, and that's people. Our people migrated, that section, there's another section that migrated our people. And that our people migrated from all around the world. Waikupe came, other people came like Abel Tasman and James Cook, and many others came to this place. People that you'll hear from today came from places like Scotland. And so in terms of the migratory part, can we build not only a place that's good for birds, but is good for people and good for fish, and use our plants so that we can get there. So our last, so that's our last piece in terms of all coming together. One of the things that we can do in terms of coming together is thinking about how us as people can come together. The important parts of how we come together is a little more on tolerance. We've heard a little from our Prime Minister in the last couple of days as she gave a speech at Harvard University. And as she talked there, she talked about our communication with each other in terms of social media, and how we need to be thinking a little more about kindness in terms of social media. One of the things that we can start thinking about, and that sometimes people say, let's think local, let's think global, but act local. I wouldn't mind saying, let's think local and act local as well. Let's think about what different treasures we have locally. Wairarapa Moana is something that in our treaty claim will be returned to us as Māori in terms of the lake bed. One of the opportunities that I've had is to be an assistant or a advisor to the negotiators. And we were sitting in a room in Carterton Event Centre called the Hiranui-o-Rangi, named after a marae that I belong to. And as we were sitting there with the chief negotiator, and the chief negotiator said to us, what's your aspiration for Wairarapa Moana? And there was quiet in our room, and I volunteered to have a crack at the answer. And it was a great privilege for me to say that one of the aspirations we have for Wairarapa Moana as Māori is for it to be a native fishery. And so that our native fish can have a home and a place, and that we value our native fish so that it could be a space that we support our native fish. Our native fish will need to have a whole lot more macrophytes that are there than there right now. And so how can we build a moana so our native fishery can be there? I didn't know at the time, but I was very lucky with my answer, because the Crown's chief negotiator was somebody who was a keen fisherman. And so he started to understand what we were talking about in terms of fish and how we might operate there. And so in terms of my ancestor, Wairarapa Moana, kei te mihi, ki a koe, e tipuna tāwhito, kei te mihi. I want to thank Wairarapa Moana for supporting our people for living here. As our people were able to get 20 tons of tuna a year out of Lake Wairarapa in a sustainable way, and that we could support the floodwaters of our ancestor Lake Wairarapa as it went floodplains, and went from a 68 square kilometre lake to over a 200 square kilometre lake. That in the waters of Lake Wairarapa, we had a taniwha, Rākauru, and Rākauru looked after our lake and looked after us. Once Bishop Virco at Waitangi gave a speech, a really prominent speech about being in Waitangi. And he used the words of a song, by the rivers of Babylon where we sat down and then we cried. And so we mourn the state that our lake is in, but we're not ready to give up. We want to heal our lake. Scientifically, our lake is at supertrophic. In order for us to, and then somebody asked me one time, what's the next step? I said, it's dead. And so we can't get into the space where we can't do anything, that our lake is dying. If we have any opportunity right now to arrest the injury and the state of the lake, the state of our maitipuna, the state of our moana, we need to do that. And if we are going to do that, we need to move it out of the too hard basket. We need to bring on everybody. I've got a faith in all the people of Wairarapa, that we know the connection between us and the land. We know that we can stop and feel the wairua and understand in our solitude that we're here with the Taiao. The Taiao means, if we break it up into a compound word, Taiao now, the Tai means the tide and the Ao means the earth. A tide has a regular rhythm, a regular beat to it. And so if it's an earthly rhythm, an earthly tide, then what's the rhythm that we can hear? If we listen to people who are sick, their rhythm might be intermittent, and their rhythm might be working too hard. What's the regular rhythm that we can maintain in our lake and return the heartbeat? We can't afford for Lake Wairarapa to be in the too hard basket. Yeah, in Kaiwhakahaere, kia ora koutou, kei te mihi ki a koutou, kia ora koutou. Thank you very much for listening.